So we'll be going live in a couple of minutes, so just give me a second to get my CSGO and everything all sorted. If anyone sees any problems with the stream, let me know before I start, preferably. Alright. It would appear we can go live. Everything looks in order. Just check my audio is working. Right, yep, my audio is working. Okay. So, just before I start, if anybody wants to follow along or use this document or have a look at this document, which I have here on the left-hand side, if I can make this full screen. If anyone wants to follow this document along as we go, then in the description of the stream, you should be able to find this document. Obviously, it's not going to be very much use just staring at it, so as I go through the stream, I'm going to obviously be explaining what everything means on here. So see if I can get this connected to the side. There we go. Right. Oh, let's go. Right, so this will follow the same format as last week. So if anyone wasn't here for the last week's stream, what we're essentially going to be doing is we're going to be talking over a new map. Today will be Inferno. We're going to go over a map overview. So we're going to talk about the primary entrances, as in where the T's can enter the sites, secondary entrances, and then we're going to go over some general setups. We'll then talk over zoning, which I'll explain in more detail when we get there. After that, we'll follow up with map control for the CT and T sites, so the typical areas. Then obviously we'll go into a bit more detail as to which setups can be useful, which setups are good for these types of map control on the CT side, and how, as a terrorist, you can obviously play against some of these setups. And then we're going to move finally onto the T setups, and we're going to go over defaults. So we're not going to go over any strats or anything like that. That's for you guys to decide as a if you're an individual or if you're playing in a team. Then it's up to you to decide if you want to take some form of strategy. My job here is to show you different ways of potentially playing overpass if you're very stuck in playing one sort of static way. So we're going to try and do this a little bit more half and half. I don't think I'll be able to achieve that. And what I mean by that is I'll use Noesis, this tool right here, basically a drawing board to explain some of my stuff. And then if I have the opportunity, I will go in-game and I will explain over some of the more sort of advanced parts of this lesson. So as I said, if anyone wants to follow this along, if anyone wants to get this document up, then it should be able to be found in the description of the stream. But if not, then obviously it's there for the VOD if you watch this video back. So let's begin. So last week we started with talking over the entrances, the primary and secondary entrances, so we're going to explain that in a bit of detail at the start. So if we compare this to a map like Mirage, we've got a much easier way of playing with our 5 players than we do on a map like Mirage, for example. And what I mean by that is, so when you look at Inferno, there's 4 main entrances onto the site. So I've marked these areas in white. But anywhere where there's white, these areas right here, these are potential places that an opponent can obviously advance. So with 5 players, you can hold at all times all of these positions and have 1 rotation, which means at all times if you're playing a passive hold, the only way the opponents can really overthrow the site is if they overthrow those really passive holds, or they catch your rotator off moving between sites, which obviously will leave a site a little bit weaker. But you could, for example, just play 3A and 2B, and you could, in theory, be able to have a decent hold. Now, obviously, that's never the case. You can obviously do smoke executes as a terrorist, and you can easily overthrow this. But when you compare this to a map like Mirage, which has 6 entrances, it obviously is a lot more difficult to hold a map like Mirage because there's always a chink in the armor, and it's very easy to find. But Inferno, it's much harder to find that chink in the armor. You never have to worry too much as a team about rotating a player, etc, etc. The only way the opponents can really take a position off you is if they get a kill, or they get 2 kills, because then you're left with 3 players, and obviously with 4 to cover, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So when we're talking about secondary entrances, we obviously push this further down. So anywhere where you have map control, so let's say banana, let's say brackets, let's say apartments, if you have any of these areas as a counter-terrorist, obviously there again is there's 4 entrances. So once again, with map aggression as a counter-terrorist, you can still rotate a player with no problems at all, and have all of the entrances covered. Typically, though, when you take a place like apartments, it's going to be quite hard to hold aggressively towards stairs and bedroom at the same time. So these are things, obviously, you have to be aware of. And if you're obviously holding brackets control, which is what a lot of teams do nowadays, or that has been the meta for at least 5 or 6 years, as far as I can recall, then you have to be aware of, obviously, apps control. You have to be aware of the T-stake and apps control, and if you're taking banana, again, you've only got this 1 entrance to cover, so it's not really a problem. The only problem with taking banana control is, obviously, you use a lot of utility, which means even though there's only 1 entrance to cover, the enemies can easily retake it if you haven't got that utility to hold it or uphold it. So now that we've covered that, what this essentially means is on Inferno, you only really need 4 players in order to have a decent CT hold, which means if you go a player down, you can in theory still win. You can still hold almost all the areas. It just means that, for example, if you lose a player on B, you can still hold B with the 1 entrance. However, it's going to be a lot weaker, which means you will potentially rotate a player off A, for example, and then obviously you're only left with 2 players on A, which now means there's a weakness in the armor. So Inferno is a map where if you get a kill on the T side, you obviously can hopefully find some form of weakness in the defense, and if you obviously lose a player on the CT side, then you have to be a little bit more smart about if you're going to rotate a player over, or if you're going to trust in that site which has lost the player to hold that position. But it should always be possible to hold with 4 players, in theory. Obviously, as said, it's never like that, but that's how it is. So moving on. General T-site setup. We'll clear this now. We'll obviously talk about our general T-site setups. So the most common one, the most common used, and the reason why it's most common used is, I'll explain that in a second, is obviously your 2-1-2. So what that means is you have 2 banana, you have 1 middle, and you have 2 apps. Now, what specifically is good about this default is that you're not pushing to one specific part of the map at one time. What you're trying to do is you're trying to fight on all accords. So, for example, you could be taking banana control with your 2 players, so you could potentially be pushing up aggressive banana control to try and take full control of banana, push the opponents back towards the site. You can also do the same in apps. So, for example, you can use either with 2 players going into apps, or 1 player going into apps with the other assistant. So, for example, this player right here can throw flashbangs and molotovs and grenades off this door right here, which I can quickly show you in-game. As I said, I will try and show you as much as I can in-game. So, for example, you can throw flashbangs. Oh, off this doorway right here. So obviously it's not going to go how I want it. You can throw one to there, and you can also throw one which lands here. You can also throw grenades which land right here off the doorway. So you can do a lot with the assist type playlist from 2-second mid. So you could either push with 2, or you can push with 1 and have 1 assisting with utility from a distance. And you can also be attacking mid at the same time. So again, with 2-on-2, the way this can work is either you can push this guy from second mid into mid to meet up for a mid attack, or you could have this guy, for example, come towards stairs, and you can again attack brackets with 2 players, or you can have these 2 players attacking apps and trying to pull the short player back, and obviously this player attacking mid at the same time. So what you can essentially do with a 2-on-2 is you can attack all areas at the same time without too much panic about losing a player, because it's a very, very broad setup. If you lose a player, let's say you lose this player mid, then it's very easy to trade frag somewhere else. You could try and trade frag with guys peeking to B, you could try and trade frag with a guy looking at apps, you could try and trade frag from a guy potentially in staircase. So usually wherever you lose a player on this type of default, you're usually going to gain it back quite quick, which is why this default is the most common taken, because it spreads your aggression across the board. Now we'll look at the other type of default. Now this is one which is quite commonly used in sort of the main to advanced kind of level. I believe in the Icelandic scene it's also used very, very heavily, and this would be heavy banana control. Now this has its advantages and disadvantages. So when you have 3 players banana, you can more evenly spread your utility usage across the players, which means if you potentially fully take banana control, let's say you get all of your players up here, then depending on how you've taken it, you could, for example, use less. Like if you were going with 2 players, you would maybe have to use both your mollies. You'd have to use at least 1 or 2 flashes. You might even use a smoke depending on the situation. You might use grenades, and that means that these 2 players could potentially have nothing left, because one is potentially assisting and the other one is trying to take banana control. Now if you go with 3 players, obviously that becomes a lot easier. You can have one of these players, for example, using a Molotov, another one using a flashbang, a secondary flashbang coming from someone more behind. You could also double nade, for example, here, or you could double nade into the corner at the beginning of the round, and that way you can spread your utility more evenly. It's much easier to take banana control with better bot flashes, for example, which means if your primary focus is going to be towards banana, or for example you see the enemies are heavy banana team for the CT side, then you might want to edit up your default to go 3-on-1. What this does mean, however, is it makes it a lot more difficult for a solo apps play and a solo mid play, because let's say you lose one guy apps, the mid guy isn't going to be able to refrag that, and obviously if you guys peek into B with 1 or 2 players and you've been heavily aggressive taking the banana control, then they're easily going to be able to rotate a player over it even if you get a kill. So refragging on this type of setup obviously comes with its disadvantages of the fact that it's very, very difficult. Unless you lose a banana player, then there's the biggest area where you can get that refrag. Yeah, and obviously you take more risk. You take more risk putting 1 player here and 1 player here. If they want to go aggressive, they're obviously going to have to go high risk, high reward, otherwise they might not reap the benefits. So those are your most common T-side setups. They have their advantages, they have their disadvantages. That's just quite generalized. What I would say is, if you're a team or if you're a player which plays in teams that heavily focus on 3-1-1, then I would maybe suggest trying to implement 2-on-2s into your playstyle and see if that changes anything. Being a bit more aggressive in apt while at the same time being more aggressive in banana, and looking if you can get any mid picks, maybe an AWP, for example. Now your general CT side setup is not that. It is 3-2. Now this is the most common setup, and there really isn't very much more you can do on this apart from if you're going early aggressive banana. That means 3 towards A and 2 towards B. So obviously everyone knows this is the most essential setup. As I mentioned before, you've basically got 4 entrants into site. You've got 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. Now, if you, for example, keep 1 long, 1 short, and 1 pit, then if needed, the pit guy can watch both short and apartments, and the short guy can rotate off. The short guy could watch both short and apps as well, and the pit guy can rotate off. Or you could potentially play 2 towards long, and one of the long plays could be rotator, and the pit can watch obviously these 2 locations right here. So this is the reason why this is the most common setup, because it's better to have your rotator player towards A rather than obviously a rotator to a player towards B. And there's only one entrance towards B, which means as long as you don't lose your players early on B and you save a little bit of utility for the end of the round, then typically B is going to be quite a hard site to take because everything comes through one single choke point. So they have to do full scale executes in order to take the B site. So that's the reason why this setup's the most commonly used. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, and I think it's important that we talk obviously a bit later in detail where the strengths and the weaknesses are. So moving on, we're going to talk over zoning now. Now, if I mention this every single time we go over a new map, but if you're not aware of zoning, I made a whole hour YouTube video on that. So if you want to, at the end of the lesson, look back if you're a little bit confused as to what zoning is, then you can find that video on my YouTube channel. It was a stream that we did before for Vodafone, but I'm going to explain it in very, very basic detail. Basically, zoning means 2 things. You have primary and secondary zones. Now, primary zones are any areas which are attached to the sites. So I'm going to quickly draw those on right now. So for A site, it would obviously be short, it would be long, and it would be apartments. And for B site, it would be towards the CT area, the graveyard, or the courtyard, sorry, and top banana. Now, what's quite important about Inferno, which is different to other maps, is retaking is incredibly difficult because the positions in which your primary zones are usually the positions where the opponent should already or have already came through. So for example, short and apartments are typically places where the opponents come from already. So they're usually going to have control of these, which means you can't just leave your site and go into these positions. And long control, again, if the opponents have done an execute where, for example, they smoke off the speedway here or the connector, then the opponents will probably already have long control, which means retaking a site is incredibly difficult as they've already got the positions which you want to have as your primary zones. So that's a basic overview of primary zones. It's any position that you can retake your site very well from. Now, I'll quickly show you in game where these positions are. So obviously you can have a visual feeling to it. So if you have apartments control, for example, as the counter-terrorist retake in the site, you can throw Molotovs pretty much any way you need. Obviously you're not going to throw one towards graveyard, you can obviously throw pit, you can throw onto site, very dodgy, but yeah, basically from apartments you can throw anything you need. From short you can do easy execute, smoke, retake smokes, you can for example smoke off pit, you can molly pit, you can nade onto the site, you can molly onto the site, you can do lots of things if you have short control, and the same for obviously long. You can even do flash assists, for example if you have teammates coming short, you can obviously flash deep short. If there's any players watching pit right here, they're going to be blind from that type of flash. You can throw smokes down to big pit and mini pit, and you can obviously molly off apartments and lots of things. So it's good to have any 3 of these positions. These are your primary zones. These are positions in which you can easily retake the site. And obviously, now we can obviously show B. So we have top banana, we have the towards CT spawn, and we have the courtyard. I think it's called construction in Icelandic. I'm not 100% certain, but I call this the courtyard. So if you have any of these 3 positions, again, you're easily able to retake site. As you know, from top banana you can throw every type of utility towards B, smoke, nade, flash, Molotov. From this position here you can do the exact same. Obviously, if you're behind these positions, it becomes a lot more difficult. So if, for example, you've only got this controller banana on the retake because they have top banana, if you have here, you are stuck in here, for example, it's going to be very, very difficult to retake the site. You can't throw any utility from here. You can throw limited utility from here, and again, you can throw limited utility from here. And the same for A. If you only have brackets control as a counter-terrorist retake, and you only have apps control up to here, and you only have library or connector, it becomes, again, almost impossible to retake your site. So when we're looking at retaking, we need to bear in mind where are our primary zones, and we need to focus on taking those first before we take our site. Don't, as you're rotating from, let's say, B to A, immediately burst into long because you think it's clear. This is the position first that you need in order to retake site. So even if you feel the enemies aren't there, it's worth checking. And the same and vice versa. If you're coming from A, then obviously you want this area right here, or you want this area right here, which means these become your primary focus. Obviously, if the bomb's down, yeah, you want to get the bomb defused, but first you need these positions. In order to have a decent retake, you need those positions. So that's going to be your primary focus. And secondary zones, if we quickly talk over those. So secondary zones is your pathway through from one site to the other. So the three for this game would obviously be CT, it would be middle, and it would be T-spawn. So these are the three areas in which your secondary zones are. So obviously, brief description of that. It's the path in which you take in order to get from the zone which you're leaving from. So let's say you're leaving from A and you want to go to B through banana, then you're going to have to go through this area right here, which means this is the secondary zone that you need to be aware of. So there could be enemies anywhere here. So if we go in game, I'll give you a couple of really quick examples for if you're moving through mid. There's a couple of places you need to be aware of. There could potentially be a guy here. Obviously, you might call these lurkers, whatever you want to call them, easy for you. I call them zoners. You could have a guy on here. You could have a guy potentially here. You could have a guy bottom mid. You could have a guy there in Mexico or underpass. You could have somebody holding very passive second mid here and waiting for footsteps and then peeking out at the last moment. You could have a guy on stairs. You can have basically someone anywhere. Anywhere which can see this secondary zone is places you need to be aware of. So if you're rotating from A to B, what I wouldn't suggest is knife out and just sprinting. Because, as I said, there's over 10 positions where enemies could be. And if you're taking this direct path to the B site, and there's 5 enemies alive, or there's 4 enemies alive, and you haven't had confirmation from your players who lost the B site how many players they saw, then you need to be aware of all of these positions. And it's not just for middle, but it's basically for any area. So if you're going over mid, you need to be aware of all the places for mid. If you're going over the T-spawn, obviously be aware they could be on top of bridge, they could be in this area right here, they could be in the kitchen area, they could be towards the spawn. If you go in CT again, you need to bear in mind, did they have long control if I'm rotating from A towards B and I need to go through this path right here? Did they early in the round take long control? Because if they did, now I need to be aware of players potentially being anywhere around here. Or if they've already taken B site, could the opponents already be up towards tree? Could they already be in our CT spawn? And I think this is something that players usually get complacent with, is they don't think about the potential of the danger which they get from rotating from site to site. They just have their goal, I need to be at the B site or I need to be at the A site, and they just run directly towards it without thinking, okay, let's first clear out a secondary zone. Now, one thing I would suggest is if you are rotating from A and you are going banana, for example, you're taking this route right here, what I would suggest is if you're with 2 players, then put all of your primary focus is on that secondary zone. So forget about the site for now. Even if the bomb's planted, focus on mid. So you need to get through mid safely, and you need to get through mid quickly, which means as players, that will be where your primary focus is. So you might want to say, for example, let's clear mid. Let's check second mid as we go past. Check boiler. Check Mexico or underpass, and check towards T-spawn as we go into banana. That way, you're moving quickly through it, you're organized, you have the communication in place that basically says this is what we need to be doing as a pair when we're moving towards a B site, and vice versa. If you're going with 2 players the opposite way towards A, then you might want to do the same thing. As you get to bottom banana, obviously saying, where should be checked, you need to be aware of players second mid, you need to be aware of players potentially holding this angle, anyone boiler, anyone here, anyone here. So before you think about the A site, first thinking about your secondary zones. Now that's what you need to get into a habit of doing. It's obviously quite difficult, but that's just the way it is. So, moving on from that, that's the CT side. So, now we're talking about the T side. So, primary zones for A and B. as I mentioned, there's 3 main primary zones. So you're going to have short, you're going to have long, and you're going to have apps. Now what I would say for A is, typically I have a rule for Inferno, you want to try and take 2 out of 3. But, in my opinion, for the A site you only need 1. So if you have short control, then all you have to be aware of is potentially getting backstabbed from apps, but you should also have boiler control, which means if enemies are rotating from B and they go in this whole long way around, they're going to be very, very, very slow. So typically having one position, so either long, short, or apps, is usually going to be just fine for the A site. It's going to make the retake a lot more difficult. If they don't have, for example, if you take long control, you know that they can only come from short and apps, which means if you have anyone else sort of towards pit and whatnot, it's very, very easy for them. They don't have to focus on long at all, they can focus all their attention here. And vice versa, if you have short, you know that they can really only come from long, and they'll typically go through this play way if you've already got short, because they know that you'll have control of brackets. So they'll focus most of their attention through this choke point. And this is why for the A site I would say always try to take 1 out of 3. Now obviously, in order to get to the site, you have to go through a primary zone, which means if you can't take, for example, long control, which would be my recommendation, if I was going to take 1, it would be long. If you can't take long, then just keep the ones that you used to get into the site. So if you went all up short, keep short control. If you went all through apps, try and leave 1 in apps. And then potentially take in short as well, because then at least you've got 2 out of 3. And if you split it, then again, keep 1 player short or keep 1 player apps, or 1 in each. And that way it's going to be very, very easy for you. If you're pushing all through long, or you're pushing the majority of your players through long, again, leave 1 guy behind if possible. Obviously in all situations it's not doable, but I would say always try to leave 1 in long, because this is the most important primary zone. You keep long control, very, very difficult for the enemies to retake it all. If they focus their attention through short, from a banana rotate for example, they're going to get pinched very, very easily. You can do very simple crossfires, for example, from long and pit. It's very, very easy for you to keep those areas. And for B, 2 out of 3. So obviously you have top banana, you have construction, and you have towards CT. So I would say if you're going B, you're typically going through banana. You're obviously not really going to go through construction. So obviously that's a place to take after you take B site. Or if you come through CT, then I would say you could potentially leave a player here, or have a player in this location right here, and obviously cutting off this primary zone that way. Or leaving a player CT and then you have the secondary zone. But I would say 2 out of 3. Try and keep 2 out of 3 of these. So if you come through banana, get banana control, get construction control. If you come through banana and take instantly 2 kills and you catch the enemies off guard, then instantly try and push a guy to take this zone right here. This zone will be your most important primary zone. So if you're trying to get 2 out of 3, I would probably go for these 2, because these are your best 2. Otherwise, banana is obviously your third option, and if you can't take any of these 2, then just keep your banana and maybe try and focus a little bit on taking construction. So that is what we've got for now. I'm going to give you a couple more tips in what to do if you can't take some of those primary zones. We'll start with A. Now, let's say I said long is your most important primary zone. Let's say you can't take long control, or maybe you have taken long control. You can push the opponents back even further. Now what I mean by this, let's say you can only get to here. Library is the rotation, it's the through point for the rotation. So what you could do is potentially smoke the end of library. Now if you donk a smoke right here, now you shouldn't really have to focus much more on library, because they might think you're in library control. So if you can, try and push the opponents back behind their primary zone if you can. Obviously, if you're just sat here and waiting, then they're going to push through, and they're going to try and get those kills, because obviously they want to retake the site. So if you can push them behind their primary zone, which makes them not even want to come there in the first place, then that's more advantageous. So what I would say is if you get long control, you could smoke off Speedway, for example. That way, if enemies are rotating, then they might see that smoke and they might just think, okay, maybe it's time just to save. Because they're going to have to put much more of a fight if they're trying to retake and you've smoked off, let's say, here, and you smoked off, let's say, here. Or it doesn't have to be smokes, it can be mollies. So if you're getting control of long, or maybe you can't get control of long, then again, try and smoke off this area right here, try and smoke off library. Obviously you can do the smoke which lands here from pit. You can also do that smoke which lands here from this location right here. You can also do it from brackets. So that's a little tip that I would say. If you can't take long control, then at least try to limit the ability for the opponents to have long control for the retake by throwing some smokes. And the same on B. So as I said, this area right here is your most important area. As you can see right here, this is quite a short berth between here and here. So what I would say is, if you're on B site and you have a smoke and the bomb's planted, then and you can't take control of there, then throw a smoke which lands in this area right here. Obviously, I would suggest it be a lot deeper than this. For example, I would say definitely throw it so it's as deep as this, which means that they can't see around the right side of this and they can't see across the left side. And then they just sat behind the smoke. They won't want to advance on that because they're going in blind. They will have to use a lot of utility, in which then you would know that they're. So if you, for example, again, get construction of this area right here, or inside of construction itself, then bank a smoke off this wall, preferably not as bad as this. I mean, you could underthrow it if you really wanted, and that way you've got a more secure hold of long without actually having the long control itself. So you could, as soon as you take the site, throw the smoke, and then leave this area and go focus on, let's say, banana control. Because at least then you know opponents probably aren't going to push through this smoke blindly, because that would obviously be high risk. Obviously high reward for the opponents, but usually with high risk means that your opponents aren't going to take those risks. And those would be my tips for if you can't take long control or you can't take CT control, then try and get a smoke which lands in these locations here, because that would allow you to cut off those rotations or potentially make the opponents think, okay, it's not even worth retaking. We have no access to the retake here. Now moving on. Let's talk about map control. CT map control. We got banana, we got brackets, mid apps, and second mid. So if we draw those out, so for B, banana, we have the brackets area. If we want to go hyper aggressive on the A side, it would be mid and second mid. And we also have apps. So those are your main areas for the CT control. Obviously, you could take here, for example, but you're really not going to get anything from it. The only thing that you might be able to do is doing sort of CT secondary zoning. So if the opponents don't know you're here, you could potentially sit here and kill anyone rotating back off through banana. But yeah, there's not really use taking this area. So these are your main map control. We're going to talk through them. We're going to talk over the setups. But the team map control is much more simple. It's just banana, it's brackets, and it's apartments. So we're obviously not going to go on to talking over map control on the T side because it's incredibly complex, but we will talk over defaults and how you can use them to take map control. So, CT setups. Let's talk over banana first. Now, every single setup here is going to use the 3-2 standard. Now, as I said at the very beginning, the 3-2 standard is basically what every team uses. And it's not worth me talking in very much detail about it. You would have played it 100%. All that is 3 players towards A and 2 players towards B. Everyone's done it. Everyone knows what it is. Its strengths are that you always have a rotator player ready on the A site. Playing towards the speedway, you can obviously get information from anyone top banana from speedway and sort of long in this area right here. It's very easy to hold brackets this way, and you can potentially do any form of aggression banana or on the A site with this setup. So we're not going to talk over the 3-2, but I wanted to at least put it in here so you could see this setup is good for everything. So if you don't know what to do, just go for a 3-2, 3A, 2B. Now let's talk about the other setups. 2-on-2. Now what I mean by that is 2 towards the A site, 1 towards the speedway, sort of long rotate. So you could technically say this is a 3-2 setup, but we're looking more towards 3 static towards the A site, 1 sort of permanently on the retake, and 1 towards B. Now what this would allow you to do is you can go aggressive banana, and you can have that rotate in case you lose a player. You're instantly ready to get the rotate in case you lose a player, and in case these guys hear anything apps, for example, then this guy's here to hold long, or he's here to instantly rotate again. So this setup's good for having a player always on hand very quickly. Now, if you were to go for a 3-2 setup, and you want that, always have that player on hand very quickly, it's a little bit more difficult. If you're having this player here, for example, this rotator player more towards a long area, it's going to take an extra 4 to 5 seconds to rotate. You might not be able to get the speed that's required for taking banana control. Because when you're taking banana control, you obviously have a lot of risk with it, which means you need a player instantly ready to rotate. And the second setup, which I would say, is 2 to 3. Obviously, almost all teams use this nowadays. It's where you send 3 either early round or mid round in order to take banana control. Now, what I see a lot of teams doing is they only really take banana control at the very beginning, so at the very start of the round, and they go for this setup, so a 3-2. So they slam as many players, or the 3 players towards B, take B control, and instantly leave, and then all go A. Now, one thing you can do on the CT side to be aware of this is if they're taking heavy banana control, then you can probably presume that they're 3B. So you could instantly attack A if they're going heavy banana, because this is a very common setup, which is where this has its weaknesses in you're stacking all your players more towards banana and you're leaving A very, very open. If you are trying to hold brackets control with this, then one player short has to hold both apps and boiler and mid, which is very, very dangerous. So 3 to 2 is very good for taking aggressive banana control. What I would suggest for teams is try to use the 3 to 2 setup more in the mid round. I think this is an undervalued area of Counter-Strike in which teams aren't putting a third player towards B in the mid round to take banana control when they could. Obviously, you can take banana control with 2 players in the mid round from B, but what this allows you to do is, let's say you rotate this guy over to go for your 3 to 2. So you have 2 sort of passing towards A and 3 about to go aggressive towards banana mid-round. Then this player rotating can throw a smoke which lands deep from this location. It can also throw flashbangs which bang in this area, and you can also get a Molotov, etc., etc. So I think this 3 to 2 setup, I would say, 2 to 3 setup, I would say is very, very overused in the early round and not very used in the late round. So I'd definitely suggest looking into that as an option for teams. If you haven't already tried it, give it a try. You might think it's a terrible idea, but that's the whole point of brackets, for trying new things. And that's the whole point of me showing you these things, is to suggest new ideas and hopefully bring you into the perspective of it's worth trying new things. Because at the end of the day, the meta is constantly developing, and if you find that new idea which could potentially push your team above and beyond another, you should always take that chance and try new things. So, brackets control. 3 to 2 again. As we said before, very, very easy. 3 players A, 2 players B. You can always have control of brackets. There's only 1 entrance here and 1 entrance here for brackets control, which means you only have to focus with your 2 players on 2 entrances, which means you always have it covered. And your third player can obviously watch apartments. He can either be long and watch apartments, or he could either be pit or on-site, which means, or even short. And you can watch all 3 of these areas with 3 players in A. So this setup, very, very standard, very, very good. 4 to 1. 4 players towards the A site. Now this is a setup I don't see as often, but I would like to start seeing more because it has its advantages. Typically when a team goes B, or takes banana control on the T side, they'll take it nice and slow. Unless they're going for a full-blown execute, then typically you'll get the slow banana take, using a couple mollies, couple flashbangs, maybe some nades, heavy aggression to try and push the B players back. So as long as this player right here sort of shows a little bit of defiance in the early banana, maybe throwing a flashbang at the very beginning to make sure that there's no rush, having a Molotov on hand, then the 4 to 1 can be an effective setup, and I think it's definitely worth looking into. At the end of the day, the B player only has 1 area to look at. Now, obviously, when 5 people are pushing into the site, it's going to be very hard for him to hold. But with 4 players on A, you can retake B. If you get control of here and you get control of here, and potentially even your third rotator zone with the 4 players that were A, if you split up and try to take all these areas and you successfully get those, then retaking B site is very, very easy with 4 players. It's a little bit more difficult with 3, and it's almost impossible with 2. So don't be afraid to try a 4-1 setup, for example, because it has its advantages of the A site is typically the site which loses the most control. You're going to lose banana control at some point in the round, that's a given. But brackets is one that can be fought, and if you have 4 players towards A, you can fight brackets with so much firepower. You can triple nade. If the enemies throw 1 smoke towards long, you can triple nade mid. Or you can throw a double nade and follow up with a single nade a little bit later. You can have a guy permanently watching apps with no problem. You can have 3 on short, 3 on long, 2 short, 1 long, 2 long, 1 short. There's a lot of variations which a lot of teams aren't seeing when playing this setup. And typical for Inferno, take banana control, move your players back, take brackets control, and then you make a decision. That's your typical game plan on the T side. That's the current meta. So if you are 4-1, you give banana control up as the counter terrorists, then they focus on brackets, and you just annihilate them with 4 players. So I think this is a setup that's definitely undervalued, most certainly should be having a look at. And 2-3 again. So having 2 towards A and 3 towards B, you can focus both of your attention on brackets. As I said, there's only 2 entrances. You can have this short player focusing both on boiler, and the apps exit, and the long player, for example, watching towards mid. Now, the reason why you might use this setup, so 3 towards B and 2 towards A, is if you see the opponents are going very heavy very heavy banana, then you might want to start putting 3 towards B. But you don't want to show them that you're 3 towards B. So you don't want to just start aggressive banana for no reason. It allows you to go passive brackets and have a decent hold brackets. If you start showing heavy resistance on banana, they're just going to instantly rotate off and kill the 2 players on A. So you don't want to show heavy resistance, but you want to be in a position to catch them off guard, while obviously holding brackets. And that's where that sort of setup has its advantage. Moving on, 3-2 for mid control. So we're talking about this area right here. Again, standard setup. You can easily take mid through banana and through mid through the A players. This setup works really, really well. It's a very standard setup. You can hold banana with these 2 players and start aggressing with 3 towards A. And you can distract banana while you're attacking 3 towards A. So very, very simple. Works all the time. 4-1 again. Same thing. Keeping that 1 player with his molly, keeping it with a smoke, ready for any form of B strat, B execute, and having 4 towards A, and then going for a full out execute. So for example, there's a couple of things you could do here. If you've got 4 towards A, you can throw a flash straight from long towards second mid to cut any sort of shenanigans going on in second mid. You can smoke deep here. You can smoke, for example, deep here. You can also smoke here. You can peek from apps towards mid. You can do so much with these 4 players towards apps. Obviously, this ties in with a second mid as well. This setup, again, really good for a second mid and mid. So I would suggest if you're going to try and go for a mid, maybe try a 4-1 setup. It's definitely worth looking into. I don't think a lot of teams are doing this, and it's a very valid option. There's no real reason that you wouldn't do it if it's in prac. Obviously, in officials, you need to be aware that the opponents could easily see this and abuse you. But for prac, it's for developing your guys' team's ability or your ability as players. So 4-1, definitely a recommendation in my book. 2-3. 2-3. Again, so 2 players towards A, 3 towards B. So you could, for example, go for it in this way. Now, what this would be more aimed at doing is trying to force the opponents to go banana. So you might want to aggress with just 2, but don't go hyper aggressive in order that you're going to lose those players, because then they can instantly take A site. But you want to go with enough aggression that you want to try and filter the opponents towards that banana control, towards that B site. So that was what I'd recommend for 2-3 sort of setup towards apps. And if we obviously catering this to second mid, exactly the same situation. So keeping your 3 on B a little bit more passive and potentially trying to force the opponents up towards that B site. So that's basically it for mid and second mid. And then apps, again, 2-3. So The reason why this could be a decent setup for apps is, as we mentioned at the very beginning, there's only 2 entrances into apps, and then there's obviously 1 mid. So the only thing you really have to be wary of is if you're playing 2 apps, or you're playing for apps control, is mid could potentially be open. So you could potentially have just 1 in apps, so you can have 1 player here, and you could have also 1 maybe watching mid from short, for example, or on balcony, watching towards short and long. Obviously, the thing you have to be aware of is potentially players coming through this location right here. But don't be afraid to try and go for an aggressive apps hold with 2 players towards A and having the other 3 towards B. Because let's say you do take aggressive apps. If they can't take that off you, then they're going to try and maybe go towards B, or they're going to go for a B split. Now, if you have 3 players already on B, it's going to be very easy for you. So keep this option in mind. 3-2 for taking heavy apps control. A must, at least for prac, to try. But that's what we've got for CT setups. I hope there's a couple of things maybe in there that you thought, okay, I've never thought about that, especially the 1-4 setup and the 3 towards the B site setup. You just have to think, where's its strengths, where's its weaknesses. If you're obviously only playing 1 play towards B, you don't want this guy going hyper aggressive and trying to kill himself, because it's not going to work. And obviously, if you're playing 2 players towards A and 3 towards B, then you don't want these guys going stupidly aggressive and trying to die. And you don't want to have these guys going really aggressive, because you could filter the enemies towards A. So you need to balance. There's a sweet balance that you need to find when doing these types of setups, and you need to think, where's its strengths, where's its weaknesses, and you want to push for those strengths and weaknesses. Now we're going to talk very briefly over some setups. Some defaults. We're not really going to go into much detail on all of its strengths and weaknesses, but I'm more going to show you why I think it's worth having multiple defaults for a map like Inferno. So we'll start with obviously what we said at the beginning. So the general T-side defaults are is banana control. So it's 3, 1, 1. Now I'm not going to repeat what I said at the beginning, but basically this is okay. The problem is everyone knows how to play against it. So let's look at some other variations. We talked over the 2-1-2, so I'm not going to talk over it again. But the reason why this is strong in particular is fighting on all accords. So that's basically all you need to know for that. With a default like this, you can fight everywhere. And that is very important for Inferno, because map control is not key on Inferno, because you don't really gain much from getting map control. It just means that the opponents find it a little bit more difficult to get information, because they can still hold. For example, if you take brackets control, they can still hold here, here, here with 3 players, and they can still hold here and here with these 2 players. So they still have 5 positions to hold with 5 players if you take brackets control, for example, and the CTs are fine with not losing a player but losing map control. So you don't gain much with map control on Inferno, but it can be important to fight on all fronts, and you want to try and reduce the amount of players that the CTs have. Getting that first entry is essential on Inferno as a terrorist, because it will potentially open up a weakness in the armor. Now, heavy apps, this is something again which isn't really being looked into, but removing the banana default and focusing more towards the apps control. Now again, this can be super useful for coordinating mid splits, so 1 player or potentially 2 players eventually coming towards brackets, guys coming out towards boiler, and people also fighting on pit. So what this is going to do is it's going to keep the pit player distracted. Short's going to have to be aware that they could potentially get an attack from behind if they lose their pit player, and long might have to pull back to support obviously the site and pit. So you can fight from all 3 areas. This is going to make it very strong. It's going to make it very easy for you to get map control, because the enemies aren't going to want to put too much resistance there, because it's not really worth it. Losing a player on Inferno isn't worth it. It's just too much risk to lose a player so easily. So giving up the positions are typically what's going to happen on the CT side. So this is a setup which I would probably say definitely give a try. Obviously everyone's used to going for the banana control, but I think apartments is the underrated position on this map. B-side focus, so we're looking at 3 towards 3 towards B, and 2 mid. So no one second mid, forget about second mid completely. And what this is going to mean is, obviously, if you go straight, if you are a team which like to do executes, a setup like this could be super useful. Because it means that if you go straight from taking banana control with 3 players, you can almost instantly have 5 players there. Or you can be taking banana control with 3 players, and these 2 players could be focusing on mid. That way you could be pushing the mid players back in brackets while also taking heavy banana control. And then you'll have both top banana control removed from the opponents and brackets removed from the opponents potentially at the same time, which then means you could instantly go B, or you could take it nice and slow and see if the opponents make any mistakes. And then obviously this is good for sort of B side of the map focus. And again, you don't have to have apartments control. If the enemies take it, fair play. You could just sit a player in this corner, for example, and he could make sure that he's watching towards second mid. Or you can have a player, for example, towards benches watching towards second mid, and another player going aggressive. So you don't need to have apps control, you just have to be aware of if there is no one there, they could go aggressive. And that's the only thing really you need to be aware of. Now the A side focus, this is just going to be 3 towards mid and 1 towards apps and 1 towards banana. So you can technically attack on all fronts again, but this is going to be more of taking brackets control and having some form of presence in apps once you're taking brackets control. And you have the potential to fight banana if this player is willing to take the risk. So again, I don't think this is a default that's used very much. A lot of teams use this more as a strat for taking brackets control, but you could run this every single round and easily take brackets off them every round. 3 players is all you need to take brackets, especially if you put one guy apps. If you put one guy apps, then he can get into a position like boiler or fight on balcony with the pit guy, which means these 3 players taking mid are going to find it very, very easy to take brackets. So they're your defaults. What I would say is, if you're a team which does specifically one of those types, give another type a try. It's worth looking into being adaptive with your defaults. If you can't be adaptive with your defaults, it means, like, let's say you want to go heavy banana, your default as a team is heavy banana control, and you're playing against a team which are ultimately incredibly heavy resistance on banana, then this default isn't going to be very useful. And if you don't start using other variations, then it might be very hard to find weaknesses. Let's say you're not used to playing 3 towards apps, and then they go heavy banana control on the CT side, then you might not be able to switch up to 1-1-3 to take heavy apartment control. And this is why it's important to have a look at all of your options when choosing defaults, because you want to be very responsive to your opponents. At any point during game, you should be able to say, okay, our typical default is this, but I think this game we should do this. And that means that you as a team can develop very easily. So that's basically all I've got for today. Obviously, the goal isn't to open up your mind to a new way of playing Inferno, but it's more of, hopefully, you can sit here and say, okay, that is something that we don't do very often, or we have done it, and we haven't really tested how successful it is. Or I, as an individual, have seen these things before, but I don't really think about them. So hopefully you've learned something, and I think we're going to continue down this path of going over the maps. We've obviously done Mirage now, we've done Overpass, and we've done Inferno. So I would say the next map, with exactly the same type of setup, map overview, zoning, map control, and setups, would either be Vertigo or Nuke, because those 2 maps are pretty similar, so I can easily prepare something for those. I would say that is the direction we go, and obviously in a few more weeks we will be past the maps and we can go back to watching things like demos. So that's all I've got for today. If anybody has any questions, then please shoot away now, but if not, I will be ending the stream here. So I hope you guys have learned at least something today. Obviously, I again apologize for not really spending any time in-game. I said I was going to try more 50-50, but I think with these type of sessions, it's better to go over more of the theory side of stuff than just showing you in-game. So yeah, that is what we've got for today. I hope you all enjoyed the stream, and I would like to say thanks for watching. Yeah. Thank you very much, guys. And yeah, check out Vodafone. Obviously, they sponsor these videos, so without them, they wouldn't be possible. Thank you very much, and have a good day.